Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I want to start with two questions that I really want you to think about. And the two questions are, what should I be afraid of today? And who's to blame? What should scare me and whose fault is it? To me, these are the most profoundly dangerous questions that we center our lives around. And what they are indicators, to me, what they're indicators of is a culture of scarcity, a culture of not enough. And when you think about any milieu in your life, think about education. What are we supposed to be afraid of and who's to blame? Politics, the economy, social issues. I guarantee you if you turn on the news or opened a paper today, the focus would be, here's why you should be afraid and here's whose fault it is. And what's interesting to me about that is it's not just at a cultural level or a community level. That stuff happens in my house every week. Every week with my husband, I talk to him about what should be, why we should be fearful and whose fault it is. Mostly it's his. But if something doesn't go well at my daughter's school, then I'm like, oh my God, this is going to have huge implications for our university. And we should be terrified right now that she's not getting cursive. I know she's 4, but this is still relevant. It's indicative of scarcity. So let's talk about what scarcity culture is and what it looks like. Scarcity culture, I think, is best understood with a simple question of never enough. And you can fill in the blanks. Never good enough, safe enough, certain enough, perfect enough, relevant enough. And perhaps I think one of the most dangerous and insidious messages today is never extraordinary enough. Somehow, in the world we live in today, an ordinary life has become synonymous with a meaningless life. And it has huge, and I've watched it happen not only as a researcher, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I sit across from people and look in their eyes and I have a good sense of what's going on in their lives. But as a university professor who's been teaching for the last 17 years, it's been very clear to me that extraordinary means relevant. And the top one is the big one for all of us personally, never good enough. Which is shame, which we all have on occasion, that sense that we're not smart enough, good enough, perfect enough, loved enough, promoted enough. We're not enough. So what we do in response to scarcity culture, I think all of us every day, is this. We wake up in the morning and we armor up. And we put it on and we say, I'm going to go out in the world. I'm basically just going to kick some ass. I'm not going to let anyone see who I am. And in doing so, I can protect myself against the things that hurt the most. Judgment, criticism, fear, blame, ridicule. I'm going to armor up and I'm going to be safe. And we rationalize and we convince ourselves that this armor is really smart. And we use a lot of different things to armor too. Perfectionism, intellectualizing. But if you get really, really clear about what we're doing every morning when we wake up and decide to armor, it's this simple. This is what we're protecting. We're protecting being hurt for a very simple reason that no one really wants to talk about, which is this. Love, belonging, irreducible needs of men, women, and children. In the absence of love and belonging, there is always suffering. And so what we believe is that we can protect our sense of being lovable and being acceptable and being worth connection with armor. Here's the very worst news from my research. The news that above all other, I did not want to hear, is simply this. And I don't even want to say it to you because I think it's mean to say it. But it's so true. And it's simply our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted, which is a terrible thing, but a truthful thing. That we can only love and be loved as much as we are willing to have our heart broken. And so when we move through the world like this, with our partners, with our children, with our friends, in classrooms, with the people who work for us, with the people we work for, there are tremendous casualties. And in fact, I think the troublesome thing about doing this is that it doesn't really safeguard us from pain, but it does prevent us from accessing the things that vulnerability takes us to. Vulnerability is the path to love, belonging, joy, intimacy, trust, innovation and creativity, sympathy. So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? How many of you think about empathy and sympathy as very different things? A few people. Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. I'll tell you why. Empathy is feeling with people. So if Tim called, Tim, I'm going to use you as an example. Is that okay? Go ahead. Tim called and said, I just finished my rewrites on this article. I'm trying to think of something we have in common, which is writing. I just finished my rewrites on this article, and they've sent it back again, and I just have this overwhelming feeling that nothing's going to please these folks. So to respond empathically, or empathetically, you can say it either way, I would need to try to understand his perspective, stay out of judgment, recognize what he's feeling, and kind of communicate it back. Now, when you're teaching graduate students who are new to counseling, they like to go, oh, Tim, you must be feeling so sad. I feel that with you. Which is not exactly what empathy looks like. Painfully sometimes, maybe. But if he said that to me and I went, oh, shit, I hate that. Would you know? I've been there. I hate that. Or if I looked at him and said, or talked on the phone even and said, oh God, there's nothing worse than just keep on sending it in and sending it in. That's empathy. Empathy is, I'm feeling with you. Sympathy, I'm feeling for you. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is dark, deep hole. Ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? In Texas, in the South in general, in the US, we have the worst saying ever that just smacks and reeks of sympathy, which is if Tim called and said, I keep sending it in and they keep pushing it back. And I looked at you and said, bless your heart. How does that feel? It makes you pretty mad. Because basically what I'm saying is that sucks, but too bad, and God is on my side. I've decided I can make $1 million in Texas by simply selling a t-shirt that says, if you bless my heart, I'll punch your face. So sympathy is one of the things that really gets in the way of empathy, and sympathy is also often how we respond when we don't want to be vulnerable to someone else's struggle. Does that make sense? The next one, I'm going to get hot talking about it. I just know I'm going to go into a little shame, but then I'll pop right out. Nothing will, if you're on the first row, you're safe. Blame. How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? I'm like, hi, my name is Brene. I'm a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set. And I'm getting ready to go teach. And I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who's my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back like at 10:30, chatting it up with his friends. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed at 10. Therefore, okay, and let me just ask, because I'm going to assume that you're laughing with me, not at me. How many women in here are thinking, that makes absolute sense? And how many men in here are thinking, oh, that's how it works? Right. And so the rest of that story is, I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. You're not allowed to laugh. You're here in official capacity. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? Even me. Like when I'm even I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. It gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na-na-na-na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability, meaning that people who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this. No, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger, which is really hard. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was. The last one is interesting. Empathy is not scripted. I can't say, okay, go forth and be empathic. Here's the decision tree. You know, if they say this, do this. Empathy is about being present with someone. And if you're present and engaged and you take the armor off, you'll know what the person across from you needs. But more importantly, if you screw it up and you see in the eyes of the person that you're, who's sharing with you that you've screwed it up, you can go back and say, no, Tim, okay, wait, I'm just a hugger. I'm here, I'm with you. Keep telling me, I want to know. I want to be in this with you. The reason why I think that exercise is so helpful is, again, we all need different things from empathy. There are no hard and fast rules about what empathy looks like or sounds like. But there is one that I will share with you from the research. It is, rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful. and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. How does that feel? Who said awful? Awful. Awful. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better instead of leaning into, if I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. And so I want to close with this picture, because how many of you, when someone shares something with you, do you worry about saying the right thing or being helpful? For sure, I think most of us. So I love this photo, and the reason I'm sharing it with you is because sometimes the most profound and eloquent examples of empathy happen without any words, and sometimes not even with eye contact. To me, if I'm sitting next to you and I say, wow, I feel like everything's just, the wheels are falling off right now and things are out of control, and someone just puts their hand on top of my hand and squeezes, that says, with touch, I think the two most important words in my work, which are me too. So thank y'all very much. I really appreciate it.
Simply for people who are not familiar with your work, possibly online or wherever, I think it's very important that you explain to people what the difference between shame and guilt is, because I think a lot of people have those two concepts mixed up in their mind.
Yeah.
And I think it's really key to your work that there is a big gap between those two concepts.
It's so funny because the people who really, like, I know, like we've talked, you get the work in your bones, you live the work. But people who really know the work, like I talk about 1,000 different things, but the people who really like have their head and hearts around it always come back to that question. Like it's such a, so I think what happens is when I talk about shame, people often say guilt, because there's kind of shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. And they're all kind of what in research what we would call self-conscious affects or emotion. And in order to really move through this work and understand it, you have to separate them out. And the big two that we confuse is shame and guilt. So shame is I am bad, and guilt is I did something bad. So shame is a focus on self, guilt is a focus on behavior. And it seems like semantics, it seems like kind of an academic pet peeve thing, but it's really not, because the outcomes are hugely different. So what we know from the research is that shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction, depression, aggression, violence, suicide, bullying, and almost more importantly, that guilt is inversely correlated with those outcomes. Meaning the more someone is able to separate themselves from their behaviors, the less likely it is that they'll end up in those situations or suffering from those struggles. And so the implications are huge, especially around, I think you and I have talked about parenting. You know, as it turns out, there is a tremendous difference between you're a bad girl and you're a great kid, but that was a bad choice.
If you say that doing something that you wish you hadn't done is the difference between I am bad or I did something bad. If you do something bad over and over again, isn't that then I am bad? And isn't that in a way saying that is part of who I am? And therefore, is it not saying, I mean, I've had this discussion many times through my own life saying, I just did something bad. Yeah, but you always do that. And therefore that's who you are. Okay, so yeah. I'm suggesting that maybe the gap between shame and guilt isn't quite as clear-cut as you put it.
So I've thought a lot about that question as it relates to parenting and as it relates to school and behaviors in school and work. I'm going to come down on the side that I still think there's a huge difference between shame and guilt, and here's why. When we see people change behaviors, make amends, when we see positive behavioral change, you can almost always track it back to guilt. Guilt is basically, it's uncomfortable, but I'm a fan of it because it's cognitive dissonance. It's, I've done something and I'm holding it up against my values and it doesn't feel right. And so that's guilt. And other researchers use different words for the affects, but for most part, shame researchers use that as guilt. So it makes sense to me. Shame corrodes the part of us that believes we can change. So let's say you're my child and you lied at school. And there's a big difference between, listen, Tim, lying's not okay. And hey, Tim, you're a liar. Then the question becomes, you lie again and you lie again. And at what point is it not, hey, you lied, but hey, you're a liar? From a parenting perspective, to me, it's the point at which I give up believing you can make different choices.
Okay, and that carries on throughout life.
Yeah, because there's something very self-fulfilling about when I'm a cheater or I'm a liar and it's who I am, how do I do something different?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Brene. That's fantastic.